They called him the Black Fox, the Calico Cowboy, a rustler, a thief, a gunslinger, who rode the borderlands and cheated death more times than anyone could count. For over a century, the legend of Isam Dart has echoed across the American West, a black cowboy who turned outlaw and met his end at the hands of the infamous Tom Horn. But here's the thing, almost everything you've heard about him is wrong. His entire story, from the outlaw nicknames to the gunslinger reputation, was built on myths and not facts. Today, we're going to tell the legend story, then get into the facts and tell the true story of Isam Dart. And thank you to Dan Davidson, Paul Knowles, Bob Silbernagel, and everyone at the Museum of Northwest Colorado and Craig for their help with this. Well, let's get into it, shall we? My name's Steven, and welcome to Wild West Deep Dives. Isam Dart, born Ned Huddleston in 1849 in Arkansas, entered the world in chains. Enslaved from birth, his first taste of the wider world came during the Civil War, when, at 12, he was taken by his master, a Confederate soldier, to Texas. There, he was made to help steal food and supplies for Confederate troops. Huddleston, who would later become known as the Black Fox or Calico Cowboy, learned early how to survive on the fringes of law and necessity. When the war ended and slavery was abolished, Ned returned to Arkansas as a free man due to the Emancipation Proclamation, but freedom offered little in terms of direction. Like many formerly enslaved men, he drifted west in search of opportunity, adventure, and perhaps to escape from his past. His wandering took him west, where he worked odd jobs and eventually found his way to the wild frontier towns of Wyoming Territory. At a Union Pacific construction camp near Rock Springs, he quickly proved himself more than a target of prejustice. One day, with a single six-shooter, he fired into a meadow and dropped 5 sage grouse in one volley. This feat earned him the name Quickshot, and a legend began to form. Huddleston then drifted further south to the Texas-Mexico border, working as a rodeo clown, bronco buster, and stunt rider. Yet the lure of the outlaw life was always nearby. He discovered that rustling cattle and horses across the Rio Grande and selling them in Texas was far more profitable than clowning in rodeos. Over the years, he rode for the Galt game. Sometimes he tried to go straight, prospecting, bronc breaking, even ranching, but he inevitably returned to the dangerous, shadowed life of an outlaw. By the mid-1870s, Huddleston had moved into the rugged, isolated region of Browns Park on the borders of Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah. It was a place known as a haven for rustlers, outlaws, and independent ranchers who resisted the grip of the big cattle companies. There, Huddleston reinvented himself as Isam Dart. Dart worked breaking wild horses, prospecting, and even tried ranching under his own brand, the ID Bar. He was respected for his horsemanship and generosity, but his reputation was never free of suspicion. Gambling, fights, and stolen cattle often clung to his name. Still, he was no ordinary outlaw. On one occasion, after being arrested by a Wyoming deputy, Dart had the perfect opportunity for escape, when the deputy's wagon overturned and the deputy was badly injured. Instead of fleeing, Dart saved the deputy's life, brought him to Rock Springs for medical care, then surrendered himself voluntarily. The jury later acquitted Dart after the deputy testified on his behalf, a story that showed the complicated man he was, both outlaw and honorable cowboy. By the 1890s, Browns Park was at the heart of a range war. The powerful two-bar cattle companies sought to push out the small ranchers, many of whom survived by rustling livestock. Dart fell in with Ann Bassett, the fiery young rancher named the Queen of the Rustlers. Ann was not only tied to Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch, but also deeply entrenched in a personal feud with the cattle barons. Together, Ann Bassett and Isam Dart openly rustled two-bar cattle, defying the power of the big ranches. Fed up, the cattle companies turned to a hired gun, Tom Horn. Horn, a former Pinkerton detective and government scout, had a brutal reputation. Paid $500 per kill, over $19,000 today, Horn was tasked with ending the rustling at Browns Park. In July 1900, Horn assassinated another rancher, Matt Rash. Then the warnings began. Dart and others received notes ordering them to leave the valley or face the same fate. Most men packed up. but Dart refused. He was determined to stay. On the morning of the 3rd of October, 1900, at his cabin on Cold Spring Mountain, Dart stepped outside. 2 shots rang out from a hidden rifle. He collapsed instantly, dead at around 51 years old. The assassin's trail was traced to Tom Horn, who had been lurking in the area under an alias. Cartridges from a Winchester .30-30, Horn's trademark weapon, were found near the scene. Isam Dart was laid to rest near his cabin on Cold Spring Mountain. His grave, a lonely marker of life caught between 2 worlds. To some, he was an outlaw, a rustler who lived by theft and defiance. To others, he was a skilled cowboy, a man of generosity and principle, who more than once tried to carve out an honest life on the frontier. He carried many names in his lifetime: Ned Huddleston, Quickshot, Black Fox, Calico Cowboy, and Isam Dart. Each name tells a different story, reflecting a man who could never quite escape the contradictions of his world. Born enslaved, freed into lawlessness, and forever balancing between survival and respectability. The problem is, almost all of that popular story is flat out untrue. Everywhere you look, you'll find the same version of Isam Dart, repeated over and over again. I was ready to run with it myself, research done, notes typed up, ready to rock and roll, until I stumbled across an article by Bob Silbernagel. His article essentially said that the whole story of Isam Dart is untrue. Naturally, I had to dig deeper. I reached out to Bob, and he pointed me towards Dan Davidson, the director of the Museum of Northwest Colorado in Craig. Davidson has spent the last 25 years piecing together the real history of Isam Dart. So I got him on the phone, and what started as one call turned into 3 separate conversations, each running close to an hour. And what I learned was shocking. The legend of Isam Dart and the real man are 2 completely different people. In 1927, a book titled Outskirts Episodes by W.G. Titsworth was released. It told the story of Ned Huddleston, alias Isam Dart, alongside a character named Matt Rasper, who bore a striking resemblance to the real rancher Matt Rash, along with a host of other details that were only slightly altered. Though the book was labeled as historical fiction, its use of real names or barely disguised ones blurred the line between fact and storytelling. Over time, these pages came to be read not as fiction, but as truth. And here's the thing, Ned Huddleston wasn't even a real person, but for almost a century, Isam Dart was thought to be nothing more than an alias, his life story twisted into legend. But instead of picking apart the fiction line by line, let's set the record straight and dive into the true story of Isam Dart. Isam Dart was born in Texas, not Arkansas, in 1858 in Seguin, Guadalupe County, to parents Cyrus and Indiana. His mother was born in Mississippi and his father in South Carolina. Isam shows up on the 1870 census down in Texas. There was a group of about 3 other black families in the area. Now it's unclear if Isam's parents were born into slavery or how the family got to Texas, but Isam was not. The family were farmers. The first verifiable appearance of Isam Dart outside of Texas comes in the Sand Hills region of Nebraska. Like many freedmen drifting west after the Civil War, Dart was moving steadily northward, working odd jobs and trying to establish himself. Before firmly settling in Browns Park, Dart worked for the Middlesex Cattle Company in the Rock Springs Green River region of Wyoming. We know this because the Rock Springs paper puts him there in 1885. This was during a time when large cattle outfits were expanding northward and westward, looking for prime rangeland. After the catastrophic winter of 1886-87, which killed vast numbers of cattle across the northern plains, this caused the Middlesex Company to go bankrupt. Ranchers realized that Browns Park in northwest Colorado offered a natural winter refuge for herds. It was in this context that Dart moved into the valley, eventually linking up with Matt Rash, a small rancher in the area who, side note, was distantly related to Davy Crockett in a roundabout way. Rash, like many Browns Park ranchers, resisted the dominance of big outfits like the Two Bar Cattle Company, with the majority owner being a man by the name of Ora Haley. Dart's association with Rash put him squarely in the middle of the tensions that would later spark the Browns Park Range War. Isam became involved in the Bassett Ranch, which was run by Ann and Josie Bassett. The Bassett Ranch was started by Herb and Elizabeth Bassett, who came west from Arkansas in the 1870s, becoming one of the first families in the region, establishing the Bassett Ranch by the 1880s. Isam was known as a bronc buster, a roper. Today we would call them cowboys, but then they didn't want to be known as cowboys, but Broncbusters. Routt County was described by James Knobloch, who will come up later on, as the least developed of all sections of Colorado, and seems to have fully as many, if not greater resources than any other section. The farms of the Bear River Valley are unsurpassed in any country for location productive qualities, and the vast fields of coal will in the future bring this section of the state to the front, while for fishing and hunting it is unsurpassed. Isam Dart made this area his home and quickly earned the reputation as being a top cowhand and skilled horseman. Joe Davenport, one of Isam's friends, told the Rock Springs newspaper in 1929 that he had seen all the great riders, but for all-around skill as a cowman, Isam Dart was unexcelled and Joe never saw his peer. He would then add that Dart was fond of watching bucking contests and often attended bucking horse contests at Grand Junction. He could outride any of them, but he never entered a contest. But in July of 1889, Dart found himself under arrest by Deputy Sheriff Elroy P. Philbrick on 3 counts of illegally branding cattle. The sheriff took him by buggy to Green River for the court case, but along the way, the buggy flipped and Philbrick was hurt badly. Instead of running for freedom, Isam loaded the sheriff up and took him to Green River seeking medical treatment. Once he saw to that, he turned himself in. He then proceeded to file a case against the deputy for wrongful arrest, essentially saying that he didn't have a valid summons for the arrest, and he couldn't just take him out of Routt County and take him to Wyoming. There is no further information on this, it was likely just thrown out. At one time, Isam Dart served as Justice of the Peace in the far north part above Browns Park, just below Wyoming. He ran for office and was elected of a very small district. This is when the battle between the Hoy brothers and the Bassett family with their cowboys began to unfold. In 1889, V.S. Hoy put summons for all of his neighbors in Browns Park for stealing their cattle. They hauled essentially everybody to Bonds Peak, a town that had no jail. They instead were housed in hotels, women in one, men in the other, with one deputy to guard them. That should work, right? In the end, there were 5 men that V.S. Hoy actually tried. Agnes A. McDougall, John Finch, a man named Colin, a man named Reynolds, and Isam Dart. The men stood accused of arson, burning the residence, haystack, corrals, and barns of Henry Hoy in Browns Park on the 5th of November. According to the Aspen Daily Chronicle on the 30th of September 1890, James B. Knobloch, remember him? He was the stenographer of the 9th Judicial District. He had returned from the court held in Browns Park from the period of the 8th of September to the 19th of September. He reported that the most important case tried was the case involving Isam Dart. The story goes that Hoy was absent from the ranch at the time, and because of repeated thefts, his hired men and brother had a spring gun set in the house. When Colin tried to sneak in, he was shot in the leg but soon recovered and later fled the country. Colin and Reynolds were never arrested. The trial proceeded only against McDougall and Finch, as Isam Dart had simply walked out of the hotel and left. Remember how the quote-unquote prisoners were housed in the hotels with only one guard to watch over them? Yeah, so Isam just left. But evidence showed the defendants were together on the night of the fire. Witness William Amends, several miles away, saw Hoy's haystack burning around 9:15 p.m. Later, around 10 p.m., Dart, McDougall, Finch, and Reynolds arrived at Colin's house with their horses sweating. When Amends commented about the horses sweating, McDougall replied, "No wonder they are sweating, look at the fires." Amends also testified that the group said that if the spring gun had killed Colin, there would not have been a Hoy living by morning. The morning after the fire, all the defendants except Colin went to the burned Hoy ranch. Witness William Amends observed tracks at the scene and compared them to those of the men present. He testified that tracks left by overshoes matched those worn by John Finch, and boot prints matched those of Angus McDougall. Amends further stated that on the night after the fire, the men had openly discussed and essentially admitted their involvement, treating the matter casually and making no attempt to conceal it. Despite a long and rigorous cross-examination, Amends' testimony remained consistent. Additional witnesses supported the case. V.S. Hoy and his wife also testified about the tracks. Frank Woolsey recounted hearing John Finch talk in his sleep, admitting that he was one of the party who had burned the Hoy buildings. Now, taken alone, admitting to a crime in your sleep and being convicted of it sounds insane. But according to Woolsey, Fitch later confirmed that what he had said in his sleep was true. How much of that is true is unknown. This testimony provided the most direct evidence of guilt, and the jury ultimately found Angus McDougall and John Finch guilty of arson. The court sentenced both men to 5 years in prison. The next major case was People vs. Angus McDougall, this time for altering and defacing the livestock brand of Hoy. McDougall was accused of converting the Hoy brand into a bar of his own brand. Isam Dart was jointly indicted. The evidence was circumstantial, but key testimony came from William Walters. He testified that one morning he passed by McDougall, who was tampering with a horse carrying the Hoy brand. Later that same afternoon, Walters saw the horse again, but now its brand had been altered, defaced, and marked with a bar over their original. Walters also observed Dart and McDougall repeatedly tending to the sores around the tampered brand. When Walters questioned why the injuries always appeared in the same spot, Dart brushed it off as damage from barbed wire fences, then warned him, "Young fellow, you keep still, or you will find yourself hanging on a tree." Walters stopped raising questions after that. At trial, the horses were brought in as evidence, allowing the jury to examine the altered brands themselves. Combined with additional testimony and circumstantial proof, this convinced the jury of McDougall's guilt. He was sentenced to 2.5 years in the penitentiary, added to the 5 years from his earlier conviction, bringing his total sentence to 7.5 years. During the time that Finch and McDougall were serving their sentence, and Isam was away from Browns Park, the only photo of Isam Dart was taken by John Green, a black photographer from Denver. This is the one tintype that is the only verified photo of Isam Dart, taken in roughly 1892. This is the photo you are looking at now. The guns were stage props, and not his actual revolvers. And remember, everything is reversed because of the tintype. Isam sent this to the Allen family, who at the time lived in Rockville, Illinois. They had deep ties to the Browns Park area, and in Browns Park, you'll find Allen Bottom, a place named after John Allen, who was Justice of the Peace at the time in 1890. Isam Dart came back to Browns Park around 1894, and in 1898, he joined the side of the law and was involved in the manhunt for Harry Tracy. According to Paul Knowles from the Museum of Northwest Colorado, who is an expert on Harry Tracy, men named Pat Johnson, John Bennett, and a teenager named William Strain were playing cards one night, when Strain, being a teenager, was messing with Pat Johnson, kicking his chair, just causing mischief. When Johnson got upset with the teenager's mischievous acts, he stood up and pulled his pistol. As Strain rushed out the door, Johnson fired and hit Strain in the back, ultimately killing him. Johnson said he just meant to scare him, but the deed had been done, and Johnson and Bennett rode off to Powder Springs. In the meantime, Harry Tracy escaped from the Utah pen with a few other men, and him and David Lance stuck together and made their way through Browns Park to Powder Springs and joined up with Johnson and Bennett. The Routt County Sheriff was coincidentally on his way to Browns Park for Bennett and Johnson for cattle rustling. On his way, he came across 3 men on horseback, but as he tried to approach, the men broke trail and the sheriff lost them and made his way to the Bassett Ranch. Upon arrival, Strain's brother told Sheriff Nyman that Johnson had killed his brother. Sheriff Nyman formed a posse consisting of local ranchers, including Isam Dart, to pursue the outlaws. The following day, they came across a smoldering fire and a camp full of supplies from the 3 men, said to be Johnson, Tracy, and Lamb. The second day of their pursuit, they again came across a smoldering fire and knew the men were close. Sheriff Nyman didn't like the situation and wanted to pull out, but Valentine Hoy, hot over the situation, decided that they should pursue the men. As he stepped over the smoldering fire and stepped through a split boulder, he was shot through the chest by Harry Tracy. Valentine died on the spot as the outlaws fled. The outlaws were pursued to Powder Springs, but they didn't quite make it. Another branch of the posse, which included Isam Dart, found the men. There was a small shootout, but the men were eventually captured and taken back to the Bassett Ranch. Here, the Wyoming sheriff took Johnson back to Wyoming to be tried for murder. There was also the Utah sheriff, but after Tracy killed Hoy, Sheriff Nyman told the Utah sheriff that Tracy and Lamp were now his prisoners and took them back to Hans Peak. While all this was happening, John Bennett, in search of his fellow outlaws, fired 3 signal shots, not aware that a posse was after them. Eb Bassett, who was in the posse, located him and told him that they were out searching for cattle but weren't having much luck. He then told him to come back to the ranch for a good meal and a place to lay his head. Bennett agreed, and the men rode back to the Bassett Ranch, where Sheriff Nyman was arresting him as he was returning from hunting the 3 other outlaws. Bennett was placed in the quote-unquote post office at the Bassett Ranch, and while the posse went out to search for the 3 other outlaws, Bennett was under the guard of Deputy Sheriff Farnham when masked men rode up, taking Bennett and lynching him. So clearly, Isam Dart was part of the community, taking part of posses with Hoys and Bassets. Joe Davenport, in the same interview as we talked about before, explained Isam like this: "I worked side by side with him for years. He taught me all the tricks of riding. Isam was the most polite man I ever met, was a courtier supreme to his respect for women. I was just a kid when he came to this country. He kept his place and invariably ate his meals in silence alone, although not a cowman ever objected to his company. Isam Dart endeared to those who remember his excellent traits, found those conditions awaiting him when he came to my boyish jesters from San Antonio, Texas in the early 1880s. So this does 2 things. First off, verifies his birthplace being Texas, not Arkansas, and even more strikingly, that Isam Dart was no bad outlaw, but a reliable cowboy in good company. Isam Dart would start his own small ranch in Browns Park near Cold Springs Mountain and have his own brand. Legend says it was the ID bar, but it was actually reversed. It was the DI bar. And a fun note, Isam Dart had killed the last native elk in Browns Park and had it hung in his house. I say native because the Roosevelt elk were not native to Browns Park after 1900. By 1900, a giant storm came over Browns Park in terms of the land and cattle war. It was the big ranches, the 2-bar owned by Ora Haley, and the smaller ranches, ones run by men like Matt Rash, Isam Dart, and others. Ora Haley had come in from Laramie and arrived as the Utes were forced out around 1881. As he expanded his herd, he would begin to buy out some of the ranchers in the area on the Little Snake River. In 1899, Ora Haley bought the Hoy Ranch. But just as the Middlesex Company ran into problems, so did Haley and the 2-bar ranch. They considered the Browns Park Range to be underutilized. They saw it as a range that had good grasses, good water, damn good land for cattle. The issue, the small ranchers were in the way. The big ranches tried to convict these smaller ranchers in the court of law, but considering they couldn't convict them of doing anything illegal, nothing was done. It was around this time that the big ranchers in the area made the decision. Now I'm going to talk mainly about Ora Haley because frankly, the money trails back to him. But there were other big ranchers involved. But Haley met a man by the name of Tom Horn in Denver or Cheyenne and hired him on. Tom Horn was, in my opinion, one of the deadliest men in the West and will definitely be a future topic. But Haley hired him on under the guise of being a detective to find the rustlers of the area. He came in under the name of Tom Hicks and became quick friends with Matt Rash. He had heard about men like Jim McKnight and Isam Dart stealing cattle in the region. Jim McKnight was married to Josie Bassett at the time, one of the sisters running the Bassett Ranch. But they were going through a divorce, and he was living in a building of Josie's uncle on Beaver Creek. He was eventually run out of town, which ultimately probably saved his life. Now Matt Rash was the head of the Browns Park Livestock Association, so a man in charge of all that land, who better to take out for a man like Tom Horn? Tom Horn put the word out to small ranchers, like Matt Rash and Isam Dart, to leave the country or die. The men stood their ground and stayed put. Rash had been arrested several times, but was never convicted of anything. Around the 2nd of July 1900, days differ, Matt Rash was killed, shot 3 times in his home in Cold Spring, just northeast of where Isam Dart's place was. In October of 1900, Eb and George Bassett and one more were with Dart at his cabin. When Dart walked outside to his corral to saddle the horses, a shot rang out. Isam Dart was killed. There was no trial for these killings, but Tom Horn would brag about it a year later, about how he had got rid of rustling in Browns Park in one summer. Dan Davidson tells the story of when Ora Haley sold his ranch to Mr. Grounds in 1917. He told him of the 5 best cattle rustlers he'd ever seen, but Mr. Grounds could only remember 2 names, Matt Rash and Isam Dart. Just then, Haley pulls out the vouchers or receipts of the 5 dead rustlers that he had paid Tom Horn to kill, $500 per body. So why is there such a mix-up between the legend story of Isam Dart and the real story? Well, W.G. Titsworth simply made it up. It was taken as historical non-fiction, even though most of it was just complete BS. He single-handedly is responsible for destroying the reputation of Isam Dart. He essentially took people he knew, slightly changed their names, so Matt Rash in real life is Matt Rasper. Isam Dart in real life, he created this Ned Huddleston alias Isam Dart, then completely changes the entire story and publishes the book. The Gout game wasn't even an actual thing, it was just something the author made up. There is zero historical evidence of anything resembling this fictional Gout game. Therefore, for almost 100 years, nobody knew the true story of Isam Dart. Shoot, even now, very few people know the true story. I'll be nice and say this, it could have not been his intention. The author could have been writing a cool, fictional story of some people he knew and reimagined lives. But to use the same places and then similar names of every character. But at the end of the day, there is document upon document of Isam Dart being a cowboy from Texas who came to Browns Park and was just that, a cowboy. Did he wrestle a few head of cattle? I'm sure. Who didn't back then? A cow walks onto your range and is around your herd? Sure, I'll take you. The big ranches will survive. What's a couple ahead to them? I'm not trying to say he was innocent at all, and what you'll hear soon shows that. I'm just trying to give the true story of Isam Dart. He wasn't this outlaw gunslinging rustler named Ned Huddleston, who roamed the ranges of Mexico as a rodeo clown, and came to Colorado with an alias, and blah 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 blah. The big ranchers were upset at the stolen cattle, sure, but think of it this way. If you take the public rangeland in the area and imagine it as a big square, then over time these small ranchers come in and randomly throughout the square start taking up 5% of that square, where you used to run your big herd of cattle. Then they start taking a few head, so now, instead of being able to just let them be and let them feed all summer and winter, you have to constantly be hiring new hands and protecting your stock constantly. Then the damn fences keep getting put up, and now you got to buy feed for your stock, and that's getting expensive. The turnaround rate on your stock is slowing down because they don't have enough good grass to keep them fat during the winter, so you're losing money in every corner of your business because of these small ranchers. According to the State Agricultural College, Bulletin number 34, Cattle Feeding in Colorado, in May of 1896, when talking about rustlers, quote, "If it were not for the danger of loss from the source, the cattle could be left to themselves most of the time through the summer, and by the use of fences around the winter range. But little time would necessarily be devoted to them the rest of the year." Now remember that square? Well, now the free-range cattle from these big ranches only have 60% of it to range, and you have to avoid these random plots that are someone else's land. Are they a cattle rustler? Are they not? So what did these big ranchers do? They hired Tom Horn, a hired killer and a deadly one at that. It sounds horrible for me to say, but he got paid for bodies, whether guilty or innocent. With the small ranchers out of the way, they would start to gain that land back to run their cattle. And with each rancher Tom Horn killed, there was one less rustler the ranchers had to worry about. And they didn't have to worry about being convicted of murder because they paid Tom Horn to do that, who specialized in that job. It was about profit, and nobody was getting in the way of these big ranchers and their profits. Isam Dart was unfortunately just caught up in the mix, plain and simple. I'm rambling, I know it, but I wanted to put in perspective why things like this happen in the West, and I hope I explained it alright. Now if you're still on the fence, you're in luck, and man am I excited to show this to y'all. It isn't every day that you get to hear from someone who was there, in the flesh, living the life that we talk about on this podcast. But Dan Davidson and Paul Knowles from the Museum of Northwest Colorado were kind enough to give me full access and permission to use as I please an audio tape from someone who knew Isam Dart. Someone who was there when Matt Rash and Isam Dart were killed. His name is William Daniel Titsworth. He is the son of the author of Outskirts episodes. Don't worry, he's not his father, and his story is corroborated. John Grounds was the interviewer, whose dad bought the Haley Ranch. And now, I'm going to play it for y'all.
Well, Mr. Titsworth, could you give us your name and address, and about the time you came to that country in Browns Park, Colorado?
My name is William Daniel Titsworth, Branson, Missouri. I went to Wyoming at the Browns Park on May 1899. Well, I think it was the following year that there was a fellow by the name of Isam Dart and another fellow by the name of Matt Rash. It had little ranches there, little small ranches.
Well, you knew Isam Dart, did you?
Yeah, I knew him personally.
Could you tell us how you remember him? What was his appearance? Just what you can remember of it?
Well, Isam Dart he came from Texas, there in early days. And he was a bronco buster and a roper, an expert. There was nobody could compete with him in that country. He was a big, tall fellow, kind of rather raw boned, but lithe as he could be, you know. But Isam was a good rider, and he knew the country. And I've heard the old timers tell about it in the early days in the roundups, you know, when they'd have the roundup and they'd go to cutting the different brands out. There was always a lot of mavericks left. Well, they had a rule, you know, that they'd put these mavericks in a bunch, and each cow outfit would select a man to rope. Brands, see? Well, old Isam was always selected, and he could catch more calves than any two of the other fellows. He was so big and strong, you know, with it, and lithe, so they cut him down. I think they cut him down, his lariat only, I think it was 12 feet. Just big enough to make a good loop, you know. He'd just hook that old loop around their legs, you know, and fall off of that horse, and he'd have that thing hung tight where you could say jackrabbit. Oh, he was a noted one for that. But he was also suspicioned of taking cattle that didn't belong to him.
Well, that's leading now to this Tom Horn incident, is it?
Yeah.
Can you tell us what you know of that?
Well, I know that Tom Horn came into Brown's Park. Let's see, it was the same. It was the next year after, I think, fall, after I went out there. And he came in there under the name of Hicks. A fellow told me that knew. Says, this fellow in here, he says, the name of Hicks. He says he's a detective. He says he's posing as a horse buyer. Well, he got acquainted with Matt Rash and the Bassetts, and he made that his headquarters down there. And the cattle, that was in the fall, and they brought the cattle off the mountain to winter down in the park.
You'd met this man Hicks personally, had you?
Well, and not to be introduced to him, but I saw him and heard him talk. And
knew him when you saw him, huh?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so he fell in with Matt Rash, and they got quite chummy. Matt had a lot of cattle there, and he run them on Cold Spring Mountain. Well, they was quite chummy all during the winter, and then he helped Matt take the cattle up on the mountain. And shortly after that, Tom Horn, he left. He had business. He went over before he come into the parks, he stopped at Rife's ranch over there and broke some horses and things. Then after he left Cold Spring there, he went over to Rife's, and then he went over to Baggs. And at Baggs, or Dixon over there, I guess he got a little full and got into a scrap with some fella and got cut up a little. And that was along in June. Well, then, along before the 4th of July, Matt and Isam Dart, they started to Rock Springs with a few cattle. When they got in there, I think they either had 17 or 21. I think they started with only about 5 or 6. But these other cattle, it just seemed like they just attracted to these ones that they got in there and they sold them. Well, while they were spending the 4th there, Rash got a notice. Told him this is in the form of a letter, I think. Told him that he was to sell out while he was in town and leave the country, or he'd be killed. Well, he debated the thing over quite a while and talked to some friends of his, and he decided that he wouldn't anything be done right away, and so he'd go out there and kind of round cattle up and sell them and get out of the country. So he went out to the park a Saturday following 4th of July. I don't remember what the day it was, but it was on a Saturday. He got down to Bassett's in the park. He stayed there all night. Next morning he went up on Cold Spring Mountain. And there was nothing heard of Matt for till Tuesday. And Tuesday, why, one of the Myers and some of the other boys from over on Sparks's Creek there, they went up on the mountain there to look after some cattle or something, and they went over to Rash's cabin, and here lay Rash in his cabin on the bunk, shot 3 times apparently with a rifle, and blood all over the floor. And there was $40 under the blankets on the bunk, and he had out a little notebook, and there was a little blood on the notebook. But they never could figure out how that, with the amount of blood was on the floor and the distance, that Rash could survive with those 3 shots. I've been in the cabin there and looked the thing over, and the cabin was about 14 feet square, maybe, something like that. And we'd say, for instance, the door is in the southwest corner, and the door is not right at the corner, but it's far enough away from the corner so that the bunk, when you open the door, why, the bunk door jams again the bunk there. And the stove is in the right as you go in the door at the other end of the cabin. And in the opposite wall is a small window. And in front of the window was a table. And there was a can of tomatoes and some cheese on the table. And then there was a chair there that was partly turned towards the door, to an angle, see. Apparently, it looked like that Matt Rash was having him a lunch there, heard a noise and partly turned to see what the noise was, and the killer, evidently at that time, was right in the door. And as he turned, why, he shot him, and he hit him under the arm here, and the bullet ranged down and came out on the opposite side there, I think. Then he fell down on the floor, facing the killer, and tried to get up, and the killer shot him then in the breast here somewhere on one side, forget which. And that lodged in the back here in the loin, I think he said. And the other shot, I don't remember now where it went. But anyway, when he'd fall on the floor, he'd be about 8 or 10 feet from this bunk. But there was a lot of blood next to the stove. And then just a trail from there to the bunk. And whether he was carried over there or got over there himself, which looks impossible, the amount of bullets that is in him, but that was a fact. And he was fly-blowed and in terrible shape, you know. The men, then they summoned the neighbors, and they all went up there, and the only thing they could do is just, they bandaged themselves, you know, put handkerchiefs over their nose. But they finally got him onto a blanket and dug a hole in front of the cabin and just took him outside the door and rolled him in there, covered him up. And his horse was tied, the reins was hooked over a post or something out about 30, 40 yards from the house, and there was a bullet hole right in the horse's forehead, and he was dead. And there was 2 sage chickens on the saddle at the time. Well, nobody in that country Of course, nobody around. Why, there was no evidence of who killed him or anything. But everybody suspected this Horn. Because at that time, why, everybody seemed to know that Horn was just a cattle detective. It was common talk there, then see. Well, then later on, why, I was staying down to Martin Gafonte's on Beaver Creek, a rancher down there, an old timer. And Larry Curtin came riding down there one day, or one afternoon, I think it was. Told Martin, he said, somebody's killed Isam Dart. And going to have the inquest tomorrow. Wanted him to come up. Well, so Larry notified everybody in the park there if he could. So the next morning, why, Martin and I went up to Isam's cabin, which was situated up on Cold Spring Mountain, just above the Map Trail, I think it was.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, that's quite a steep trail.
Yeah.
And Isam had the corner of, or the end of a mountain, or what is the north boundary of the park there. He had a fence across it. And the other three sides didn't need fencing because a deep canyon on both sides. He just run a fence down across the base there and made a pasture. And there was a spring there and a cabin and a corral. Quite a large corral. Well, we got up there, why, here lay Isam Dart. Had him laying in a wagon box outside of the cabin. And he was, I think he had on a jacket. And he had one or two shirts. And a heavy suit of underwear. See? And he was shot just an inch to the right and an inch below the heart. No, not the heart. Just an inch to the right of the breastbone, right, and an inch below that, just to the right of the breastbone. And there was Martin Gafonte, Larry Curtin, Billy Bragg, who was running cattle, Goslin's cattle, Charlie Goslin, and Eb Bassett, George Bassett, a little fellow by the name of Whitey. Well, and J.S. Hoy. Now, J.S. Hoy is just the piece. And in that case, why, he'd act as coroner, being so far away. So they started the inquest, and they wanted one more man. Martin tried to get me to sit in on the jury, and I wouldn't do it because I just lacked 3 weeks of being of age, you see. Martin says, oh, that don't make any difference. So I said, no, I wouldn't do it. But I remember Billy Bragg came out there, and he was examining this shot. And he took a little stick, a little twig, straight twig, about the size of a small lead pencil. He run it down in that bullet hole there to see where that bullet went. Of course, he couldn't tell anything about it. But I helped dig the grave. Ed Bassett and George and somebody else, we was digging out there, and we run into a lot of rocks standing on edge like that, We had quite a time getting it down. Well, I know the story was that Isam Dart and George Bassett left the cabin that morning along about 8 o'clock and started out to the corral. They always kept a couple of horses in the corral overnight, and then they'd go out and catch fresh horses, drive fresh horses in. And they were walking side by side out towards the corral when Eb and Whitey was sitting out in front of the house there, watching them. They said they heard that shot. And they both stopped. And then he said to old Isam, just pitched right forward on his face. And George just whirled and run to the cabin, and he said they said he made it nothing flat. Well, they had run into the cabin, and that was the only outlet was the door. So they took a log out some way out of the back end of the cabin, sawed it out, and crawled out the back end of the cabin and went down the mountain and up around.
His brother was there, was he?
Yeah.
Eb.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And they got around up on the mountain there while they met, I think it was Larry Curtin. Came up on the mountain. So Larry, they told him what went on, and so Larry, he got through the fence and went in the pasture there and rounded up some horses for them, so they got them saddled. And then they summoned some other people, and they came up there and had the inquest.
The Museum of Northwest Colorado and Craig created an AI photo of Isam Dart, and it is what you are seeing right now, and I really think it brings this tintype to life. Isam Dart had his story told incorrectly for almost 100 years, said to be an outlaw, when in reality, a good soul, a damn good cowhand, and a hell of a bronc buster. To Dan Davidson, Paul Knowles, Bob Silbernagel, and everyone at the Museum of Northwest Colorado, I want to thank you from the Western community for all your diligent research and for all your help with getting this done. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope I can contribute even a little bit to writing the ship about the life of Isam Dart. Time for my outro spiel. If you enjoy Wild West Deep Dives, please give a thumbs up and maybe subscribe for more tales from the Old West. If you want to chat about Isam Dart or history in general, email me, wildwestdeepdives@gmail.com. Join the membership team. It's a great way to get access to bonus content like the first stagecoach robbery in US history. I appreciate y'all's support. We will see y'all next time. And remember, when in doubt, shoot straight, shoot fast. God bless.